On my first day at my new job, I saw my husband's photo, smiling from my coworker's desk, and when she called him her boyfriend of 3 years, I smiled back and said nothing. I fixed my lipstick in the elevator mirror on the 14th floor and told myself I was the luckiest wife in Columbus. Julian had made me eggs that morning. Over easy, the way I liked them. He kissed the top of my head on his way out the door and said, "Knock them dead, Mare." I believed him completely. Halbrook and Vance Creative took up 2 floors of a glass building on Gay Street, all exposed brick and hanging plants, and a coffee bar that made me feel like I'd finally arrived somewhere real. My new boss, a sharp woman named Renata Okafor, walked me through account services, through the media wall, through a conference room named after a river I didn't recognize. Then she stopped at a desk near mine and said, "This is Sophie. She'll be your right hand." Sophie Reyes stood up fast, all nervous energy and a good handshake. 27, maybe 28. A silver frame sat angled on the corner of her desk, catching the light from the window. I didn't mean to look at it. I just did. Julian's face, smiling, sunburned across the nose the way he got every single time we went anywhere warm. Behind him, turquoise water I recognized immediately, because I'd stood 2 feet to his left when someone took that exact photo on our honeymoon in Tulum. Except this wasn't my photo. This was hers. I kept my voice light, professional. The voice you use when you're introducing yourself to strangers who might one day be your friends. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding at the frame. Sophie's whole face changed, softened, lit up the way people light up when you ask them about the best thing in their life. "That's my boyfriend," she said. "Julian. We've been together 3 years in October." 3 years. I did the math before I even decided to do it. Julian and I had been married 2 years and 8 months. Together 4 years before that. 3 years lined up almost exactly with the entire span of our marriage. "He's handsome," I said. My voice didn't shake. I want that on the record. My voice did not shake. "He's the best," Sophie said, and turned the frame slightly, like she wanted me to get a better look. I got so lucky. Renata was already moving toward the next stop on the tour, talking about onboarding paperwork and parking validation, and I followed her because that's what you do. You follow the tour, you nod at the parking validation, you let your new coworker believe you admired her boyfriend's cheekbones, and nothing more. The rest of the tour passed in a blur I couldn't have described to you an hour later. Renata showed me the supply closet, the good coffee machine versus the one that jammed, the elevator that skipped the 7th floor for reasons nobody could fully explain. I nodded at all of it. I said something about being excited to start. I have no idea, to this day, whether I sounded like myself when I said it. I sat down at my new desk 20 minutes later and stared at my monitor without turning it on. Somewhere behind me, Sophie Reyes was humming while she worked, 20 feet from a photograph of my husband, smiling on my honeymoon, captioned with a lie she didn't know she was living. I smiled back at her that morning, and I said nothing. I want to explain how I got there because none of it makes sense without the years underneath it. I was 34 years old that spring. Julian was 38. We met in June of 2019 at my college roommate's wedding outside Cincinnati, at a barn venue with string lights and a bar that ran out of good bourbon by 9. He was a groomsman. I was a bridesmaid with blistered feet and a glass of warm champagne. He found me by the dessert table and said, "I've been told I'm supposed to make small talk with you for at least 10 minutes. Can we skip to the part where we're actually interesting?" I laughed before I could stop myself. That was Julian's whole talent, really. He made you laugh before you could stop yourself, and by the time you thought to be careful, you already liked him too much to bother. He worked at Meridian Trust Partners, a boutique wealth management firm downtown, as a senior client relations manager. He described it the way people describe jobs that sound more important than they can fully explain. Client onboarding, portfolio strategy meetings, relationship management for high net worth families. He wore good suits. He knew wine. He called his mother every Sunday, which I found unbearably charming at the time, and which I now understand was simply another rehearsed line in a very long performance. We dated for 2.5 years. He proposed on Valentine's Day 2022 at the restaurant where we'd had our first real dinner, down on one knee between the breadbasket and the check. I cried into a cloth napkin. My mother cried on the phone. We married on September 10th, 2022, at a vineyard in Hocking Hills. 60 guests, string quartet, my father walking me down a gravel path lined with mason jars full of wildflowers. I tell you all of this not because it matters what the flowers looked like. I tell you because I need you to understand that I did not marry a stranger. I married a man I had watched closely for 3 years, and I did not see it. That's the part that still keeps me up sometimes. Not what he did, how well he did it. There were signs. There are always signs, in hindsight, lined up like a trail somebody left on purpose, daring you to notice. Julian was unreachable most Thursday evenings. Client dinners, he called them. Leadership retreats. Compliance training that runs long. I used to make a joke of it, texting him around 8 o'clock. "Are you still alive in there?" And he'd write back an hour later, "Barely, save me a plate." I never once thought to ask why compliance training required a hotel 3 blocks from his office. I never thought to ask anything, because he always had an answer ready before I finished forming the question. There was one specific night that mattered more than I understood at the time. Our first anniversary, September 2023. Julian told me he had to fly to Chicago for a 2-day compliance retreat that landed infuriatingly right on top of our date. I was disappointed. He seemed genuinely disappointed too, which I now recognize as the tell I should have caught. A man who is actually lying to to you, rarely bothers looking sorry about it. He'd already stopped needing to feel anything real about disappointing me. 2 weeks later, going through the joint checking account to reconcile our anniversary dinner reservation, which he'd insisted on rescheduling for the following weekend, I found a charge. The Continental on 3rd, $190. Dated the night he told me he was in Chicago. I asked him about it, casually, over dinner. The way you ask about something you assume has a boring explanation. Oh, that, he said, barely looking up from his plate. The Chicago thing fell through last minute. Corporate didn't want to eat the flight costs, so they just moved the whole retreat downtown. I would have told you, but it happened so fast, and it honestly wasn't worth mentioning. It wasn't worth mentioning. I remember him saying that. At the time, it sounded like a busy man being efficient with his words. Looking back, it sounds like a man giving me the exact minimum truth required to make a question disappear. There was a second incident, smaller, that I'd filed away even more completely. The way you file away a splinter you never bothered to dig out because it stopped hurting after a day or two. 18 months into our marriage, Julian told me he had to fly to Pittsburgh for an unscheduled compliance audit. A client's accounts had been flagged, he said, and Meridian needed someone senior on the ground by Friday. He missed my sister's engagement dinner because of it. I remember standing in my sister's kitchen that night, making excuses on his behalf to people who loved him almost as much as I did, telling them how sorry he was, how much he hated missing it, how the firm simply hadn't given him a choice. I believed every word coming out of my own mouth. That's the thing nobody tells you about being lied to well. You don't just believe the liar, you become fluent enough in the lie to defend it yourself, to people who never even asked you to. I found out much later, once Priya had finished tracing everything, that there had been no Pittsburgh audit. The credit card charge from that weekend was a bed and breakfast in Granville, 40 minutes from our house, and Denise's shoebox ledger, when I finally saw it, had a receipt from the same weekend for a florist in Newark. I don't know if he ever told her he had a sister-in-law's engagement dinner to skip. I imagine he told her something else entirely. A different excuse, tailored to a different woman. Both of us handed a story built to survive exactly as much scrutiny as we were likely to apply, and not 1 ounce more. Our wedding day, in hindsight, carries a strange double meaning I still haven't fully made peace with. 60 guests watched my father walk me down that gravel path. Julian's parents sat in the front row, his mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief I later learned she'd carried to both of his weddings, though of course I didn't know that yet. Sitting there in my dress, believing myself witnessed rather than repeated. Julian cried during his vows. I remember thinking, at the time, that a man who cries during his own wedding vows must mean every word of them. I understand now that men capable of building a decade-long architecture of overlapping lives are often extremely good at crying on command, because crying, like everything else about him, was simply another tool that had worked before. I let it disappear. That's what I did. For years, without ever framing it to myself that way, I let things disappear. Julian was warm and funny, and endlessly attentive when he was actually present. He remembered my mother's blood pressure medication schedule. He surprised my father with tickets to an Ohio State game for his 60th birthday. He held my hand under restaurant tables during arguments with my sister. He was, by every visible measure, a good husband, and I built a marriage on the visible measures because I had no reason yet to go looking underneath them. Before Halbrook and Vance, I'd spent 6 years as an internal auditor at a regional credit union in Dublin, Ohio, reconciling ledgers, flagging irregular transaction patterns, learning to read a spreadsheet the way other people read a face. I left that career for marketing because I wanted, badly, to build things instead of just checking other people's math. I didn't know yet that Julian was about to hand me the most important audit of my life, and that every instinct I'd spent 6 years training was about to come roaring back online, uninvited, on a random Tuesday in April, because a 27-year-old named Sophie Reyes kept a silver picture frame angled toward the light. By the end of my first week at Halbrook and Vance, Sophie and I were friendly in the easy, surface way new coworkers become friendly. She brought me coffee my second day, cinnamon dolce, because she'd overheard me mention it. She laughed at my jokes in meetings. She showed me pictures of her rescue dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Biscuit, and I showed her pictures of nothing, because every photo on my phone had Julian somewhere in the frame, and I had started, without quite admitting it to myself, keeping my phone face down on my desk. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that plenty of men are named Julian, that plenty of couples honeymoon in Tulum, that turquoise water looks like turquoise water everywhere in the world. Then, on a Wednesday during my second week, Sophie mentioned in passing that her boyfriend's mother lived in a house on Sycamore Lane in Westerville. That was my mother-in-law's street. I stopped being paranoid. I started being careful. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Careful, for me, meant building rules the way I used to build audit protocols. Stay normal, tell no one, keep records he'll never think to check. I opened our joint checking account that Wednesday night, the one Julian and I had shared since our wedding, the one neither of us had ever bothered to separate, because separating it would have meant admitting we needed boundaries in a marriage that was supposedly built on none. I went back 18 months. I printed nothing. I took screenshots instead, saved to a folder disguised on my phone under a fake app icon labeled recipes, because 6 years of auditing teaches you that the moment you print something is the moment somebody finds it in a drawer. The florist charge came first. Bloom and Grove, on High Street, $200. On the 15th of nearly every month for the past year and a half. I had never once received flowers from that shop. Julian brought me flowers occasionally, sure, grocery store bouquets, sweet and unremarkable, never $200 worth, and never on a schedule I could set a calendar by. Then the hotel, the Continental on 3rd, 11 charges over 14 months, every single one on a Thursday, ranging from $160 to $210. I lined the dates up against my memory, against old texts, against the excuses I'd filed away without examining. Client dinner ran long, leadership retreat, compliance session. Every excuse had a hotel charge sitting right behind it, patient, waiting for someone to finally look. I raised it with him exactly once, 3 days after I found the hotel charges, and I want to be honest about how badly I handled it, because I think that honesty matters. I didn't confront him, I tested him. I asked over dinner, in a voice I tried very hard to keep light, whether Thursdays were always going to be this busy, now that I had a new job with its own demands. Julian set down his fork. Is this about me working late? I'm just asking. You just started a stressful new job, he said, and now you're cross-examining my calendar. That's a lot of pressure to put on both of us right now, don't you think? It was such a smooth pivot. I remember admiring it, in the sick way you admire a magic trick even while you're trying to figure out where the coin went. He'd taken my question and handed it back to me as my own instability. I apologized. I actually apologized for asking my husband where he'd been. That was the first ceiling. I told myself I'd hit the edge of what I was willing to overlook, and then I overlooked it anyway, because the alternative was a version of my life I wasn't ready to hold yet. A few days after that, Julian brought up his mother's health, unprompted, at breakfast. Her blood pressure had spiked again, he said, and the doctor wanted more tests, and he was going to need to help her with appointments over the next few weeks, which might mean more evenings away, more early mornings gone before I woke. I remember feeling guilty, actively guilty, for the questions I'd asked him 3 nights earlier about his calendar, as though worrying about his mother's health and lying about hotel charges belonged to 2 entirely separate men, and only one of them deserved my suspicion. I brought his mother a get-well card that weekend. I signed it with real affection. I found out, months later, going back through Denise's shoebox with her at that kitchen table, that his mother's blood pressure had been perfectly stable that whole spring. He'd used her the way he used everything, as a soft place to hide a hard fact. I want to be honest about how effective that tactic was, because I think it's worth naming plainly for anyone listening who recognizes the shape of it. He never accused me outright of being paranoid, not after that first conversation. He didn't need to. He simply made himself smaller and more sympathetic every time I got close to something real, until my suspicions started to feel, even to me, like an act of cruelty against a man quietly managing his mother's failing health. It is an old trick. It worked on me anyway. The second ceiling came 10 days later. I noticed a charge at Halloran Jewelers downtown, $4,100, on a Tuesday in early May. I hadn't received any jewelry. My birthday wasn't for months. Our anniversary had passed. I sat with that charge for 2 full days before I understood what I was looking at, and I only understood it because of what happened next at the office. Sophie came in that Friday practically floating, holding her left hand out to Renata, to the account team, to anyone who would look. A ring, simple, elegant, obviously new. He proposed Wednesday night, she said, voice cracking with joy, at the overlook by the river. I still can't believe it. I stood at the coffee bar with my cinnamon dolce going cold in my hand and did the math out loud in my head, the way I used to do math on suspicious wire transfers back at the credit union. Wednesday night, $4,100 charged the previous Tuesday. My husband had bought a ring for a woman he called his girlfriend, using money that, as far as any bank record showed, belonged jointly to a marriage he'd never once mentioned to her. I congratulated Sophie. I hugged her. I felt her ring press cold against my shoulder blade, and I did not flinch, and I have never in my life been prouder of a performance I hated giving. The third ceiling arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do. Sophie and I went to lunch that same week, a Thai place 2 blocks from the office, and somewhere between the spring rolls and the check, she told me, glowing, that she'd handed Julian $18,000. My whole savings, she said. Well, almost. He's smart with money, way smarter than me, and he's growing it for our down payment. We're looking at houses out in New Albany. He says by the time we're back from the wedding, we'll have enough for a real down payment, maybe even build a little. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether he'd given her paperwork, an account statement, anything. He said trust is the whole point, she said, laughing a little, embarrassed, the way people laugh when they already suspect the question is fair and don't want to sit with why. I do trust him. He's never given me a reason not to. I smiled at her across that table the same way I'd smiled at her across her desk 2 weeks earlier. And somewhere behind my ribs, something cold and very clear settled into place, the way it used to when I found the beginning thread of a fraud case at the credit union and understood all at once that I was no longer looking at one bad transaction. I was looking at a system. We weren't rivals, Sophie and I. I understood that with total certainty by the time the check came. We were accounts. 2 ledgers he was managing in parallel, drawing from both, disclosing to neither. And the marriage license and the promise ring were never proof of love. They were just his method of access. A few days after the lunch with Sophie, Julian brought up money at our own kitchen table, casual, almost offhand, the way he'd learned to introduce anything he needed from me without making it sound like a request. He wanted to move $15,000 out of our joint savings into what he called a short-term opportunity a colleague at Meridian had flagged for him, something Something about a pre-IPO allocation that wouldn't stay open long. He'd need my signature on the transfer authorization by Friday. I asked, reasonably, I thought, whether I could see anything about the opportunity first. A prospectus, a firm name, anything. It's moving fast, he said. That's kind of the whole point of opportunities like this. If I wait for paperwork, it's gone before it's ours. When I hesitated, he sighed. The specific put-upon sigh of a man who has decided you are the obstacle standing between your own family and a better life. I'm trying to build something for us, Marin. I don't know why that's suddenly something I have to defend. I didn't sign it. I told him I wanted to think about it over the weekend, and he dropped the subject entirely, so completely and so fast that it should have told me everything right there. A man genuinely excited about an opportunity fights for it. A man testing whether a request will slide through unquestioned simply waits for a better week to ask again. I understand now that the $15,000 was never going into any allocation. It was going, almost certainly, into the same upstate account already quietly draining both households. One more ledger line disguised as ambition. The fourth ceiling, and the one that broke everything open, came from a habit I'd carried since my auditing days and never quite abandoned. I always looked at the memo line. Going back through 18 months of our joint account transfers, I noticed a recurring withdrawal I'd somehow skimmed past 3 times already, $2,000, moving out on the 2nd of every month to an account I didn't recognize. Routing number, unfamiliar. Memo line, simply reading, property, Meridian. I'd assumed, the first 2 times I saw it, that it was something tied to Julian's firm, a retirement contribution, a benefits deduction routed strangely. I'd stopped questioning it the way you stop questioning any recurring charge that's been there long enough to feel like furniture. But 18 months back wasn't far enough. I pulled our full account history, every statement archived, back to our wedding date and beyond, and the $2,000 transfer was there, every month, going back further than I could see in our joint account at all, which meant it hadn't started with our marriage. It had started before me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at our kitchen table with my laptop while Julian slept upstairs, arms slung over his side of the bed like a man with nothing on his conscience, and I began building a folder the way I used to build a case file. 4 sleepless nights, total, spread across that week and the next. Screenshots of the florist charges printed at the library so nothing showed on our home printer. The hotel invoices, 11 of them, laid beside a spreadsheet I built, cross-referencing everyone against a text he'd sent me that same evening. Always some version of the same lie. The jewelry receipt, our marriage certificate, the one document in the folder that was supposed to outrank all the others, and somehow felt, by the 4th night, like the flimsiest piece of paper in the stack. On top, I placed a single note, typed, unsigned. He took yours too. Beneath it, my attorney's business card. A woman named Carol Whitfield I'd hired that same week on the recommendation of a former audit colleague. I left the folder centered on Sophie's desk before anyone else arrived on a Friday morning, and I walked to my own office without looking back. And I sat there for 4 hours doing almost no actual work, waiting to hear what a person sounds like when the floor disappears under them. I never heard it. Sophie left early that day. A headache, she told Renata. I understood by then exactly what kind of headache it was. The weekend that followed was the strangest of my life. Julian made pancakes Saturday morning, the good kind, with the blueberries that burst properly instead of turning to mush. He floated the idea of a spring trip, maybe Charleston, maybe the Outer Banks, somewhere with a porch and slow mornings. He slept 8 full, untroubled hours both nights. One arm draped over me like a man who had never once been audited in his life, and I lay next to him both nights with my eyes open in the dark, running numbers, running names, running every kind gesture of the last 4 years back through a filter I hadn't had access to until now. Monday morning, Sophie walked into the office in makeup that had clearly been rebuilt more than once that weekend, foundation a shade too pale for her jaw, eyes carefully lined to disguise how little sleep sat underneath them. She looked at the empty spot on her desk where the silver frame used to sit, then she looked at me. She didn't say anything at first. She crossed the office, picked up the frame from the shelf behind her monitor where she'd apparently moved it, and turned it face down, slow and deliberate, the way you close a casket. Then she slid a folder of her own across my desk, her own transfers, records I'd never seen, and on top a single receipt. The deposit for a wedding venue outside Granville, paid in full, on a card that carried both my name and Julian's. We didn't speak in the office. We met that night at a diner off Route 161, a place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since lunch, and we laid our 2 timelines side by side across the table, like 2 halves of a map that had somehow, impossibly, been drawn to match. If you'd shown up at my desk with this 2 weeks ago, Sophie said, staring at the folder between us, I would have called you a lying, jealous coworker and ordered pancakes out of spite. I know, I said. That's why I left it and walked away. We compared everything. Her hotel nights matched mine, always the ones I'd been told were client dinners. Her florist charges landed on weeks he'd told me he was traveling. The jewelry, the $18,000, all of it slid into place against my own ledger with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation of a system operating exactly as designed, just with 2 different women fed 2 different sets of true-sounding lies. But her transfers held something mine didn't. A recurring line, same as my $2,000 mystery withdrawal, feeding the same unfamiliar account upstate memo line, always some version of property. Sophie's transfers into it had only started 8 months ago since they'd gotten engaged. Mine stretched back to before our wedding, and that account, whatever it was, had clearly been alive and feeding long before either one of us had ever met Julian Voss. "How long have you actually known?" Sophie asked me somewhere around her third cup of bad coffee, and I could tell the question wasn't accusatory so much as genuinely disoriented. The way you ask someone to confirm a timeline your own brain has started to doubt. 6 weeks, I said, give or take. 6 weeks, and you spent it building me a folder instead of just telling me to my face. I thought about that for a long moment before I answered, because I owed her an honest answer and not just a comfortable one. "I didn't know how you'd hear it," I said. "If I'd walked up to your desk and said, 'My husband is your boyfriend,' I don't think either of us survives that conversation intact. I needed you to see the proof before you had to decide whether to believe a total stranger over the man you love. That felt like the only fair way to hand it to you." She was quiet for a while after that, turning her coffee mug in slow half circles on the cracked vinyl table. "I keep trying to figure out what I missed," she finally said. "Like there has to be a moment, right? Some specific thing I should have caught, and I just wasn't paying close enough attention." "There wasn't a moment," I told her, and I meant it, because I'd spent 6 weeks searching my own memory for the exact same thing and come up with nothing solid enough to blame myself for. That's what I keep having to remind myself too. We weren't careless. He was careful. Those aren't the same failure, and only one of them was ours. She nodded slowly, like she was trying the sentence on, seeing if it fit. I don't know if it did yet that night. I think it took both of us considerably longer than one diner booth to actually believe it. I called Priya the next morning. We'd worked together at the credit union for 4 years before she left to start her own forensic accounting practice, and if there was one person on earth I trusted to trace a hungry, patient account back to its source, it was her. She came over that Wednesday night with her laptop and a legal pad, and the same unhurried, methodical calm I remembered from our audit days together, back when we'd sit for hours picking apart a member's transaction history, looking for the one line that didn't belong. "Show me everything," she said, and I did. Every screenshot, every statement, both timelines laid side by side across my dining table like evidence boards in a show neither of us wanted to be starring in. She started with the routing number on the $2,000 transfer, running it against the Federal Reserve database to identify the receiving institution, a small credit union outside Coshocton I'd never heard of. From there, it was a matter of pulling every publicly available record tied to accounts at that branch under Julian's legal name, which took longer than either of us expected, because he'd apparently opened the account under a slightly different version of his name, Julian A. Voss instead of Julian Andrew Voss, a small enough discrepancy that it had clearly been designed to slow down exactly this kind of search. Priya found it anyway, cross-referencing his social security number against a mortgage application from years earlier that had somehow ended up in a public records aggregator. "People think identity is harder to trace than money," she told me that night, tapping her pen against the legal pad. "It's always the other way around. Money leaves a trail everywhere it touches. People just don't expect anyone patient enough to follow it." It took Priya 9 days. The account, she found, predated Sophie's involvement by 9 years. It predated me by more than a decade, buried 3 transactions deep in a wire transfer history that Julian had clearly never expected 2 women to compare. Priya found a payment tagged with a county auditor's reference number, a property tax payment. The parcel record, once Priya pulled it, named 2 owners, married, filing jointly, on a property in Coshocton County, Ohio. One name was Julian Andrew Voss. The other name belonged to a woman neither Sophie nor I had ever heard him mention once, in 3 years and 4 years combined, in a single unguarded sentence. We drove out on a Saturday, 3 hours from Columbus, past cornfields and a Dairy Queen and a church with a marquee that read, "God sees everything," which felt, under the circumstances, less like a coincidence than a warning we should have taken more seriously earlier. The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a blue farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a garden gone slightly wild at the edges. A woman stepped out onto the porch before we'd even finished parking, gray hair pulled back, arms crossed, watching our car the way you watch a car you've been half expecting for years without knowing exactly when it would arrive. She looked at me, then at Sophie, then back at me. "Which one are you?" she said. "The wife or the new one?" I didn't hesitate. Both, apparently. Something in her face cracked open then, not quite a smile, closer to recognition. "Come in," she said. "I've got tea. I think we're going to need it." Her name was Denise Colbert. She was 56. She made tea in a kitchen with yellow curtains and a calendar still turned to March, and she set out a shoebox of receipts on the table between us before either of us had finished stirring in sugar. Florist charges dated back 9 years from a shop in Newark, Ohio. Hotel invoices from a Marriott downtown, dozens of them, spanning a decade. And a ledger, handwritten, careful, the kind you keep when you've stopped trusting a person's word and started trusting only numbers. Totaling what Julian had taken from her over the years, he'd called it an investment. $31,000. He told me diamonds were for people who needed proof, she said, holding up a bare left hand, turning it slowly so the light caught the place a ring should have been. It made him seem practical. It just made me the practice round, I think. Looking back, the one he learned on. She'd filed for divorce once, 4 years into their marriage, after the first time she caught him. Julian had begged, promised, wept in her kitchen, and she'd let the filing lapse before the court court ever finalized it, because he'd convinced her, the way he apparently convinced everyone, that this time would be different. "We're still married," Denise said, flat, matter of fact, like she'd said it to herself 1,000 times already, and worn all the shock out of the sentence. 12 years in June, there's no paper anywhere that says otherwise. She told us the rest slowly, in the unhurried cadence of someone who had turned the story over so many times alone that telling it out loud finally felt like relief instead of exposure. She and Julian had married young, both 26, in a small ceremony at her parents' church in Zanesville. He'd worked at a regional bank then, not Meridian, something smaller, and he'd been ambitious in a way she found magnetic at the time, and recognized now as the first symptom of a much larger hunger. They'd tried for children early and lost 2 pregnancies, and somewhere in the grief of that, she said, Julian had started disappearing for stretches she couldn't fully account for, always with an explanation just credible enough to survive one night's worth of questioning. "I have a daughter," she added, quieter, not his, from before. "She was 12 when we married, 24 now, lives out in Denver. She never liked him. Told me so at the wedding, actually, right before I walked down the aisle, which I did not appreciate at the time." She almost laughed, the sound worn thin at the edges. "She's going to enjoy being right about this for the rest of both our lives." Sophie asked gently why Denise had stayed so long after the divorce petition lapsed. "Because he made staying feel like my idea," Denise said, "every single time. I filed that petition myself, drove it to the courthouse myself, and somehow, 3 weeks later, I was the one apologizing to him for almost giving up on us. I've had 12 years to figure out how he did that, and the honest answer is, I still don't fully know. Some people are just built to make you doubt the one instinct that was right. I did the math on instinct, the same reflex that used to catch fraud, before I'd even finished reading the transaction description. Julian started traveling for a client the exact year he met me, unattached, by every appearance, charming, available. I looked at Sophie. She looked back at me, and I understood in that farmhouse kitchen that every one of us sitting at that table had been the girl at the next desk once, or the girl in the hotel room, or the girl who filed a divorce petition and let it die on a calendar because she loved someone who had never once deserved the shape of that word. I had simply never had to see the frame before. Now I had. Monday morning, Carol Whitfield laid 3 documents across her desk, side by side, like a hand of cards she'd been holding since our first meeting. A marriage license dated 12 years earlier, naming Julian Andrew Voss and Denise Marie Colbert. A divorce petition, filed 4 years into that marriage, stamped and never finalized. And last, our own marriage license application. Julian's handwriting slanted and confident across the line, asking whether either party had a prior marriage still in effect. He'd written one word: none. "He's been legally married to her this entire time," Carol said, "which means, under Ohio law, your marriage to him was void from the moment you signed this. It never began. Not legally, not ever. 2 years and 8 months. A vineyard in Hocking Hills. Mason jars of wildflowers along a gravel path. None of it had ever been real, in the one sense that was supposed to matter most. Tuesday morning, I made his eggs one last time. Over easy. I don't fully know why. I think some part of me needed to see the whole shape of the lie one final time before I set it down." He came into the kitchen in his gray t-shirt, smiling at the plate, oblivious, kissing the top of my head the way he had 1,000 mornings before this one. "Big day," he said, sliding into his chair, feeling good about the Hendricks pitch. At 7:40, his phone rang. Unknown local number. He almost let it go to voicemail, the way he always did with unfamiliar numbers, and then answered anyway. On the instinct, men like him always answer anything that might be about money. "This is he said, fork still in his other hand. I watched his face change in real time. The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes lifted off the plate and found mine across the table, and for the first time in 9 years of knowing him, I watched Julian Voss understand all at once that I already knew exactly what the voice on the other end of that line was about to tell him. He covered the receiver with his palm. His voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Do you know anything about this?" I set down my fork. I didn't raise my voice. I'd promised myself, across 4 sleepless nights and a farmhouse kitchen and a diner booth off Route 161, that when this moment finally arrived, I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me come apart the way he'd clearly assumed I eventually would, the way I imagine he'd watched Denise come apart once, a decade ago, in a kitchen not so different from mine. "I know everything," I said. "I know about Sophie. I know about Denise. I know about the Continental on 3rd, and the florist on the 15th, and the $18,000 you took from a 27-year-old who trusted you with her entire savings. I know our marriage was never legal, because you were already married to someone else the day you signed that license." His mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. "That woman on the phone," I said, "is calling from the county recorder's office, isn't she? Because I filed a request for certified copies of every document with your name on it last Thursday, and I asked them to call this number to confirm identity before releasing anything." He set the phone down on the counter, screen still lit. The woman's voice a tinny, distant murmur neither of us was listening to anymore. "I can explain everything," he said. "It's not what it looks like. Denise and I, that was over years before you and I even met. On paper, it never what? Never got finished? You had 12 years, Julian. You had a courthouse 3 miles from your office. You don't understand what it's like, growing up the way I did, watching my father." "Don't," I said. "Don't you dare hand me your father right now. I have spent 4 years learning every soft place you keep hidden behind, and I am done done being handed one of them every time you need somewhere to hide. Marin, you don't get to say my name like that anymore. I picked up my keys off the counter. I slung my bag over my shoulder. The same bag I'd carried into that glass building on Gay Street on my very first day, 4 weeks earlier, when I still believed I was the luckiest wife in Columbus. I'm not your wife, I said. I never was. But I am the woman who found you, and I want you to remember, every single day for the rest of your life, that it wasn't luck. It was arithmetic. You just finally ran the numbers with someone who knew how to read them. I looked at him once more, not with hatred, though I'd expected hatred to be the thing I felt, standing there. What I actually felt was closer to grief. The strange, disorienting grief of losing something you'd already learned, days earlier, was never yours to lose. Then I walked out the front door and did not look back. The weeks that followed moved faster than I could fully absorb, the way disasters do once the first domino finally tips. Denise filed to formalize the divorce she'd let lapse 12 years earlier, this time with Carol Whitfield's office assisting pro bono, both of them clearly finding some private satisfaction in finishing what Julian had once talked his way out of. Sophie, once the shock burned off into something closer to fury, filed a police report over the $18,000, and an assistant county prosecutor named Wes Okonkwo told her, in a phone call I sat beside her for, that financial exploitation cases like this one were more common than anyone liked to admit, and considerably more prosecutable than most victims assumed, especially with documentation as clean as ours. Ours. That was the word Wes used, and it startled me the first time I heard it, because somewhere in the space of 2 weeks, Sophie Reyes had stopped being the woman whose desk I'd walked past every morning with my jaw clenched, and started being the closest thing I had to a witness who understood, without a single word of explanation required, exactly what I'd lost. We didn't become friends easily. I want to be honest about that too. There was a period, maybe 10 days, where being in the same room as Sophie made my skin feel too tight, some old, ungenerous part of me still wanting to blame her for existing, even though I knew, with total clarity, that she'd been lied to as completely as I had. Renata quietly rearranged our seating without either of us asking, moved Sophie's desk to the far side of the account services floor, gave us both room to breathe. It helped. Distance usually does, before closeness gets a fair chance. Julian's parents took his side at first, the way parents often do on instinct before facts have fully landed. His mother called me twice, voice tight and formal, suggesting I was overreacting, that Julian had always been a complicated man, but never a cruel one, that surely there was context I wasn't considering. I stopped answering after the second call. 3 weeks later, she called Denise instead, and Denise told me later, with a dry, exhausted kind of humor, that the conversation had ended with Julian's mother crying and apologizing for things that weren't even hers to apologize for. My own family closed ranks around me fast and hard. My father drove up from Dayton the weekend it all broke, sat at my kitchen table, and said almost nothing for an hour, which from him was its own kind of devastation. My mother on the phone cried harder than I did, which somehow gave me permission to cry less, because someone had to hold the shape of the day together, and it wasn't going to be her. My sister, the same one whose engagement dinner Julian had skipped for his fictional Pittsburgh audit, drove in from Cleveland the following weekend with a trunk full of moving boxes she'd apparently bought before I'd even finished asking for help, because she said she knew me well enough to know I'd need them before I admitted it out loud. We spent a Saturday packing up 4 years of a shared life into a rented storage unit, mostly in silence, occasionally laughing at something absurd. A mug he'd once given me shaped like a smug cartoon fish. A framed photo from a trip to Charleston I could no longer look at without recalculating every date against a spreadsheet in my head. She didn't ask me to talk about my feelings that day. She just kept handing me tape and boxes, which turned out to be exactly the kind of support I actually needed. The allies I hadn't expected mattered just as much as the family I had. Wes Okonkwo, the assistant prosecutor, called me personally more than once just to walk me through where the case stood, patient in a way I'd assumed prosecutors were too busy to be. Priya refused, flatly, to bill me for a single hour of the 9 days she spent tracing that account, telling me over the phone that some debts you just don't send an invoice for. And Carol Whitfield, my attorney, who I'd hired as a stranger off a colleague's recommendation, ended up staying 2 hours past our final meeting just to make sure I actually understood every document I was signing, because, she told me, she'd seen too many women sign paperwork in a fog just to make the process end faster, and she wasn't going to let that happen to me. Julian tried for a while to reach me. Texts I didn't answer. One appearance in the lobby of Hallbrook and Vance that Renata personally walked him out of, quietly, professionally, without a scene, though I watched from the stairwell window as security escorted him to the sidewalk and felt something in my chest finally, fully, exhale. A letter, handwritten, mailed to my new apartment, 3 pages long, full of the word sorry, used so many times, it stopped meaning anything by the second page. I read it once. I didn't respond. I filed it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but because Carol told me it might matter as evidence of consciousness of guilt, and by then I'd learned to think in exactly those terms. He tried Sophie next, once it became clear I wasn't going to respond. He called her office line, which Renata had already flagged to security, and when that didn't work, he messaged her through an old account under a different name, asking her to consider recanting her statement to the prosecutor, telling her the money had always been meant for the two of them, that pressing charges would only hurt the future they'd supposedly still have together. Sophie forwarded the message to Wes Okonkwo within the hour, unread twice through before she trusted herself to respond calmly and told me afterward, in the flattest voice I'd ever heard from her, that it was the moment she stopped feeling any pull at all toward the man who'd proposed to her by the river. He wasn't asking me to stay, she said. He was asking me to help him keep doing it. Those aren't the same thing, even though for about 3 years I would have sworn they were. He tried Denise's house once too, showing up unannounced on a Sunday, and her neighbor, an older man named Roy who'd known her for 2 decades, came out onto his own porch with a shotgun cracked open over his forearm, not aimed at anything, just visible, and told Julian he thought it was time to get back in his car. Denise told me the story on the phone that night, laughing in a way that had real relief underneath it, and said Roy had been trying to find an excuse to do that for 12 years. The financial mess took longer to untangle than the emotional one, in some ways, because money doesn't care how you feel about it. It just sits there waiting to be reconciled. Because our marriage had never legally existed, the joint accounts, the shared lease, even the car titled in both our names, all of it required a separate, tedious process to unwind, one that Carol handled with a patience I couldn't have managed alone. We discovered, midway through, a credit card in my name I hadn't opened. Application submitted online 8 months into our marriage, limit $12,000, balance carried mostly in charges from the Continental on 3rd and Bloom and Grove Florist, charges I had unknowingly been building credit history to cover. I closed it the same week, disputed everything, and spent 3 months on the phone with a fraud department that eventually, mercifully, sided with me. There was also the matter of my name. I'd taken Julian's legally, back when I believed I was becoming his wife in every sense the word implies, and reversing that process turned out to require its own separate mountain of paperwork, a new social security card, a new driver's license, a new signature on every account I still held. I remember standing at the DMV counter the day I finally filed the change back, watching the clerk type Ellison over Voss on a form that would take 6 to 8 weeks to process, and feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected. Relief, mostly. A small, specific relief, getting my own name back like retrieving something I hadn't realized I'd left behind somewhere. The lease on the townhouse we'd shared took another 2 months to unwind, since both our names were on it and Julian, predictably, dragged his signature on every document Carol sent requiring his cooperation. I ended up breaking it early, eating a penalty fee neither of us had budgeted for, simply because I couldn't stand living inside those rooms any longer than I had to. Walking past the kitchen table where I'd once made him eggs, the hallway where he'd kissed the top of my head on his way out to whatever hotel or farmhouse or diamond counter had actually been waiting for him, Renata never once made me feel like my personal disaster was a professional liability, which I've since learned is rarer in a boss than it should be. She quietly moved a client call the week the annulment finalized, without ever asking why I needed the afternoon off, and left a note on my desk the next morning that just said, "Take whatever time this takes. The work will still be here." I've tried in the 2 years since to be exactly that kind of person for the people who report to me now. The legal complications stretched on for months because our marriage had never been valid. There was no divorce to file, only an annulment, a strange and clinical process that felt somehow crueler than a divorce would have. Divorce, at least, admits something real happened and then ended. Annulment simply states, in careful legal language, that nothing had ever begun. I sat in Carol's office the day the paperwork finalized and felt an emptiness I hadn't expected. Grief for a marriage the law itself now insisted had never technically existed. There was a night, maybe 6 weeks after everything came apart, when the anger finally ran out of fuel and something quieter took its place. I sat on the floor of my new apartment, boxes still half unpacked, and I let myself miss him. Not the version of Julian who'd built 2, possibly 3 parallel lives on a foundation of florist receipts and hotel points. I missed the version I'd believed I married, the one who remembered my mother's medications and held my hand under restaurant tables. I understood sitting there that grieving him didn't mean I wanted him back. It meant I was finally allowing myself to admit that something real had lived inside me for 4 years, even if the man wearing its shape had never been real at all. I went through a period, longer than I'd like to admit, of replaying specific moments looking for the exact frame where the performance ended and the man began, and I never found it, because I don't think there was one. I think Julian believed, in whatever way people like him are capable of believing things, that he loved each of us, sequentially and simultaneously, in whatever compartment of himself he'd built, to hold that particular version of the truth. That's what made him so difficult to fully hate, and so much harder to fully mourn. A simple villain would have been easier to grieve past. What I'd actually lost was a man I now understood I had never really been given the chance to know. And there's a specific, quiet devastation in mourning someone who was there the whole time and also never there at all. My therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Alvarez. I started seeing that autumn, once asked me what I thought I would have done differently, knowing what I know now, and I told her the honest answer, which surprised even me when I said it out loud. Nothing. I would have asked the same questions, at the same slightly too late moments, and believed the same charming answers, because the alternative would have meant living inside a marriage built entirely on suspicion, checking his phone every night, auditing my own husband the way I used to audit strangers' bank accounts. I didn't want that life either. I think the real lesson wasn't to trust less. It was that trust was never the mistake. He was. Denise called me during that stretch more than either of us probably expected. We talked about nothing important mostly. Her garden, Biscuit, Sophie's dog, who Denise had somehow ended up dog-sitting twice, an odd, tender alliance none of us could have predicted. Once, near the end of a call, she said, "You know, the two of you finding each other is the only good thing that man ever accidentally gave either of us." I didn't disagree with her. By late autumn, the criminal case against Julian moved forward on two fronts: financial exploitation charges tied to Sophie's $18,000 and a separate bigamy statute Wes Okonkwo's office decided, after review, was worth pursuing given the marriage license he'd falsified under penalty of law. Julian took a plea deal in November. Restitution to Sophie, restitution to Denise for the $31,000 documented in her shoebox ledger, a suspended sentence contingent on both, and a permanent mark on a record that had, until that spring, looked spotless to every single person who'd ever trusted him. I sat in the back of the courtroom the day he entered his plea. He didn't look at me. I'm not sure he looked at anyone. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment now, off 3rd Street, close enough to walk to work when the weather's good. Sophie and I get lunch most Thursdays, an odd, deliberate choice of day that we've never once discussed out loud but both understand completely. Denise visits every couple of months, usually with a jar of something she's canned, and last spring she brought seedlings for the little balcony garden I've been slowly, badly learning to keep alive. Roy, her neighbor with the shotgun, sends me a Christmas card every year now, which is not a sentence I ever expected to write about a man I've met exactly once. Work is good. Renata promoted me to senior director in September, and I run a team now that includes, unofficially, an informal audit habit nobody asked me to bring to the marketing department, but that I've stopped apologizing for. I still look at memo lines. I don't think that instinct is ever fully going away, and honestly, I've stopped wanting it to. Sophie transferred onto my team last winter by her own request, and I've watched her rebuild herself into someone sharper and less apologetic than the woman who once turned a picture frame toward the light so a stranger could get a better look at her happiness. We don't talk about Julian much anymore. We don't need to. His absence from our conversations has become its own kind of quiet victory. Some nights I still think about the shoebox on Denise's kitchen table, the ledger she kept for over a decade because she'd stopped trusting a man's word and started trusting only numbers. I understood that instinct completely because I'd built the exact same habit myself, first at a credit union reconciling strangers' accounts, then at my own kitchen table reconciling my own marriage, both times because somebody had given me a reason not to trust what they were telling me out loud. I used to think that instinct made me cold or suspicious or somehow less capable of the easy, uncomplicated trust other people seem to manage without effort. I don't think that anymore. I think it made me exactly the kind of person who could survive what happened next, and I'm no longer willing to apologize for the parts of myself that kept me standing. I think often about that first morning, the elevator mirror, the lipstick, the certainty I carried up 14 floors that I was the luckiest wife in the city. I've turned that sentence over so many times since, examining it from every angle, and here's what I've landed on. The truest thing I can tell you about the whole ordeal. I wasn't lucky, I was thorough. Luck is what happens to you. What happened to me after that morning was a choice I made, over and over, across 4 sleepless nights and a farmhouse kitchen and a diner booth off Route 161, to keep looking even when looking cost me something I very much wanted to keep believing. There's a version of this story where I find that silver frame on Sophie's desk and decide quietly to let it be someone else's problem. I think about that version sometimes, late at night, the way you think about a road you didn't take. In that version, I probably stay married a while longer. I probably keep making him eggs. I probably never meet Denise, never learn her name, never sit in her kitchen drinking tea while she shows me a shoebox that could have been my own future 10 years down the line if I'd chosen differently. I don't know that woman. I'm glad I don't. Sometimes, walking home from work along 3rd Street in the early evening, I catch my own reflection in a storefront window and think about her anyway. The woman on that gravel path in Hocking Hills, mason jars glowing along the aisle, certain she'd found the whole rest of her life waiting at the end of it. I don't feel anger toward her anymore. For a while I did. I used to think she should have known better, should have looked harder, should have caught the hotel charge the very first time instead of the 11th. I've stopped believing that. She looked as hard as anyone reasonably could have at a man who had spent a decade perfecting exactly how much scrutiny to survive. Her mistake wasn't inattention. It was simply trusting a performance polished enough to fool a courthouse, a marriage license, and 2 other intelligent women besides her. That's not a character flaw. That's just what a good enough lie can do to anyone. What I do know is that I smiled at Sophie Reyes on my very first day at Hallbrook and Vance Creative, and I said nothing. And for a long time I thought that silence was the moment I lost control of my own story. I understand now it was the opposite. That silence was the first sentence of the only version of this story where I come out the other side still standing, still whole, still entirely capable of building something true out of what was left. I still think about the beach in that photograph sometimes. The real one. The one I actually stood in, 2 feet to Julian's left, sun on my shoulders, certain I'd found the rest of my life. I don't regret the woman I was on that beach. I just wish someone could have told her that the marriage she was about to build a decade around had already been legally impossible for years, that the man kissing her sunburned nose had learned exactly how to make silence look like happiness, because he'd had a decade of practice with someone else's silence first. I don't smile and say nothing anymore, not when it matters. That's the part of me the whole ordeal actually actually managed to change. And if I'm honest, it might be the only part of it I'm grateful for. Everything else I simply survived. And surviving it in the end turned out to be enough. Not triumphant, not tidy, not the version of justice you see wrapped up neatly by the final act of a story. Just enough. A quiet, steady, unglamorous kind of enough. Built one honest transaction at a time. The only currency I've ever really trusted.